is February 7th, 2008. My name is Sue Paul, and I am at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho. I am going to be conducting a Veterans History Project interview with Mr. Eugene Bickley for the Veterans History Project in conjunction with the Library of Congress. Also present in the room is Don Carson, who will be doing the filming. Welcome to the Warhawk Air Museum, sir.
Well, thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you come here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sue.
Could you give us your complete name, please?
Well, actually, it's Eugene Harry Bickley.
And your current address, please.
Current address is 2593 East Summerdawn Drive, Meridian, Idaho 83646.
And where were you born, sir, and what year were you born?
Well, I hate to think about that. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio on November 20th, 1929.
And, sir, what division of the military did you serve in, and which war or wars did you serve in?
All right. Well, first I served in the Navy Reserve when I was in high school for 2 years. I actually did a 2-week cruise on a cruiser, so I had some active duty time for 2 weeks. Then after that, I graduated from high school, went to college for 1 year, Kent State in Ohio. And the following summer, I found out that the draft was going to start again, and I was very eligible. And I was a reservist, so I tried to go to the Navy Reserve and get called to duty as a reservist. But they said, well, no, because you missed a whole year of training when you went to college. So you're not eligible, besides all of our billets are filled for the next 6 months. He said, if you don't want to be drafted, I walked down the hall and joined the Air Force. And that's exactly what I did.
Okay.
I walked down the hall and joined the Air Force in 1954.
And which wars did you
That
serve
was the
in?
Korean War.
The Korean?
And I was an enlisted man for 4 years in the U.S. Air Force, although I never got to Korea in all that time. I went to a lot of other places, but never Korea.
And Vietnam? You also served during the Vietnam
Yes,
War?
during the Vietnam War, but this was many years later, yes.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Gene, you were born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1929. Did you grow up in Cleveland?
Yes, I did. I spent the first 20 years of my life in Cleveland, Ohio. I went to Lawn Elementary School, then I went to West High School for 4 or 5 years, and then I transferred to West Technical High School because I wanted to take another class in aeronautics. My father was a pilot, and he was a really good pilot, and I thought, well, gee, it might be fun to know something about mechanical aeronautics, and that's what I graduated from with in 1948.
Was he a pilot during World War II?
No, he was in the Civil Air Patrol. In fact, he was offered a chance to go to Florida and fly with the Civil Air Patrol during the war in 1941 and 42 when they were having problems off the coast of Florida. But my mother at the time didn't want him to go. She didn't want him to, be a pilot, so he stayed at home in Cleveland and stayed with us.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have a half-sister. I haven't seen her in about 25 years, but yes, we grew up together for 4 or 5 years when I was in school there.
And what did your father do for a living?
He was a bus driver
Okay.
with the Cleveland Transit System.
And Mom stayed home and took
Mom
care of
stayed
you
home,
all?
and she worked for a while too then, later on, yeah.
So you were 11 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yes, I was.
What are your memories of that day?
I remember I was devastated. We were in the playground playing, and it was winter time, of course. It was December. And we all stopped playing, and we couldn't believe it. We knew it was going to be a problem with some of our brothers and fathers having to go to war, and we all ran home to listen to the radio and got the full story of it. And I remember sitting around on these old radios, with my grandmother and my aunt, and tears in all of our eyes and wondering what's going to happen, in the next 2 years or 3 years. So we grew up, with Franklin Roosevelt in the war.
What are your memories of those war years as far as, rationing and brothers and uncles and
Well, rationing,
fathers
we
leaving
hadn't ever had something like that before. And my dad was a bus driver, so we were on the lowest level of getting gas. If you had a higher ranking job, you could get gas more often. So we had to be very careful what we used our gasoline for and what trips we took, mainly to the store. If we could, we'd walk to the grocery store, which was only about 2 blocks away. And so we saved the gasoline for really important things,
Do you remember when the war ended?
Yes, I do, yeah. I remember exactly when it ended,
Where
1945.
were you? Yeah.
And I was at my mother's house, and we listened to the radio, and they said the war is over. And we all hopped in a bus and went downtown Cleveland and joined the celebration. And even though I wasn't in uniform, everybody was hugging and kissing everybody. So I said, Well, I was a Boy Scout. Does that count?
Yeah. Well,
So I got a
you
few
were in high
smooches,
school
some
then.
girls, yes.
So you were in high school when
yeah,
that happened.
yeah.
What were you interested in high school? Did you have any particular interest other than aviation?
I liked radio and television and theater arts. That's what I majored in even in high school. And then, of course, when I got into college, that's what I majored in, radio and television. But they weren't really into television yet in the late 40s and early 50s. So it was mainly speech and radio and drama.
Yeah, radio was very big
Radio
in
big,
those
yes, at
years.
the time. We did a lot of radio dramas in school.
And where did you go to college?
I went to
Shane?
Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, for just 1 year. Yeah.
Okay. And then did you get a job in that before you ever got into the military? Were you working in that field?
I never worked in the field while I was a civilian, no. The only thing I did before, I drove a taxi cab 1 year at Put-in-Bay Island off to Sandusky, Ohio, which was a historic site. And that was my first brush with a Democratic president, because I was driving a touring car that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had 1932 when he was president. And it was a huge thing. It was seated about 8 to 12 people comfortably. And one time I actually had 16 people in the car in the small island as we were driving on a trip to the wineries. They were hanging on the running boards, hanging on the back of the thing. It was a huge car. And I was only going 5 miles an hour for safety's sake. But that was my first brush with a Democratic president.
Franklin Roosevelt, do you remember his death?
Oh, yes, again.
Again, you were in high school when that happened. Tell us what your memory of that is.
I remember we were playing basketball in the schoolyard. And somebody came in and said, President Roosevelt's dead. I said, come on, don't joke. Yeah, no more joke. No. He said, really? And we stopped the game, and I remember I picked up my basketball and ran all the way home. I was crying. I sat on the porch and listened to the radio over, and then the dirge music was playing, and it was very sad. And he was the only president I ever knew.
Were
from
you frightened?
31 until he died.
Was the country frightened, do you think?
Yeah, I think we wondered what was going to happen now. He was our leader, and who was going to take over. And of course, the war was over by then, but we still had the peace to worry about. And it was a pretty rough time for a couple of years. Everybody was wondering what was going to happen. And we came out of it all right.
Now, you met and married in the 1950s, is that correct?
Yes, in 1954.
And the lady that you met, her name?
Was, she doesn't like to be called Clara, but it's Clara Angela Corta. She was actually born and raised in the Idaho area. She was actually, I think she was born in Arco, and she was raised in Haley, and then she was a nurse's training when I met her in Boise when I was in the Air Force in the spring of 1954.
During high school, you were in the Navy Reserve?
Yes, and that was way back in 1948, before I got into the Air Force as an enlisted man.
Why did you go into the reserves during high school?
Well, I had friends who were Navy reservists, and we got paid like $15 a month extra money, and it was a little spending money, and we only had a drill 2 or 3 Fridays in a month for a couple of hours. And the cruise to the Prince Edward Islands was quite fun, actually, I figured I might be a little nervous, on a cruiser, but it was a very pleasant trip. We were gone 2 weeks, and we came back, and by that time, summer was almost over, and my last year of high school started. And I finished there, and then went on to Kent State. And then from there, I went working the summer job in Put-in-Bay driving Franklin Roosevelt's car. And then when I came back from summer, it was too late to register for the fall at Kent State. And that's when I found out I was about to be drafted, and I enlisted in the Air Force. Actually left Cleveland on 4 December 1950, heading to Texas. And that's where I had my basic training for about 4 months, and ended up going to a technical training school in Biloxi. And in the Air Force, I worked as what they call an electronic countermeasure engineer or technician.
Did you want to fly?
Well, I had pilot. I was on a flight status as an ECM mechanic. Most of the time, though, we did all the pre-flighting. We would go out on the flight line, and we would check the equipment that had to be ECM controlled, the navigators for the bomb run, and the GPS guiding system. And that was our job, is to make sure it was operating properly before takeoff.
And this was during the Korean War?
This was during the Korean War, 1950 to 54.
And was the United States pretty tuned into the Korean War, so close after World War II? Do you remember having a
I think there were,
The U.S. being engaged in,
I think we
emotionally
figured we wanted to
engaged.
get this war over with. You know, we had just recently, only 5 years before, finished the Korean War.
Or the World
And
War
then
II.
here we go again, back to
Yeah.
another conflict.
Right,
And we lost a lot of people over there too, unfortunately.
right.
I lost a couple of friends from high school
Did you?
who went over, and actually they were both young second lieutenants. And in those days, they said the second lieutenant's life was about 2 hours and 15 minutes in combat.
Mm,
And unfortunately, some of them didn't even get that far in their first combat duty.
yeah. How did you get into the radio?
Well, I majored
field?
in radio
Right.
in college
Uh-huh.
and theater arts. And then when I was in the Air Force in training at Biloxi Air Force Base, they had a football team, military team, and they found out they had a decent speaking voice. So they said, "Do you want to broadcast the games?" Which we played at home,
Oh,
at their own field. So I got into broadcasting football games.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we transferred from there, and I got the full-time job at California when we went to Travis Air Force Base with the Air Force. We were the 15th Bomb Wing, I believe. And I joined a theater group there and also did some radio work. And from there we went to Guam. And then my trip was to Alaska. When I came back from Alaska, near the end of the 52, 53, we were transferred to Mountain Home, Idaho, Mountain Home Air Force Base with the 5th Bomb Wing.
Mm-hmm.
And there I transferred jobs from ECM mechanic, and they wanted me to get into the public affairs area, so I became a reporter. And they had a radio show which we used to do in KIDO in downtown Boise. It was called Notes from the Blue. It was a public service radio show on every Tuesday night at 9 to 9:30 on KIDO. And another buddy of mine and myself did the announcing. It was just a disc jockey show.
And the purpose of this, from the military's
Uh-huh.
point of view, why they would have you assigned to this particular
Well, because it was
is
good
because
publicity.
It was
good
PR
and
for the
yes.
military and the civilians.
Right,
Is
we
that
played
why?
music and we,
Yeah.
gave public service announcements about
Uh-huh.
you can join the Air Force or what's available and how much fun it is and you get a great education.
Did you write the scripts?
Oh,
or
no,
did
no,
they
they
gave
were
them
ad-lib.
to you?
Everything was ad-lib.
Ad-lib.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
it
ad-lib.
was. Uh-huh.
Well, once in a while we'd have a regular, somebody would commit a commercial, they'd do it, and then we'd play it on the air.
Mhm.
But most of the time we just talked from, no script, just what we wanted to talk about.
Mhm.
And eventually we ended up with our own television show.
The military
And
did?
the same one, and at Channel 7
Really?
in Boise.
Uh-huh.
We were on every Sunday afternoon before the Ed Sullivan Show, from the 4th of May, I think, until the last week in November when I left the service.
And that, there again, was for public service
For
too.
public affairs,
For
yeah,
public
yeah.
affairs, to familiarize the civilians
With what was going
the
on at Mountain
military
Air Force Base,
and,
yeah.
uh-huh. And was this something that was quite popular on the part of the military all the way through the Vietnam War?
I don't know, the Vietnam War, I didn't see anything going on like that. But we actually did the show ourselves. It was by us. We had the Army Air Force Band and Chorus. They would be there every week, either the band or some singers, the dance band.
Mhm.
We'd have guests from the base we talked to and interviewed. We had a lot of people who had served in Korea as pilots, and they had a story to tell. And at one of our last shows, when the Korean War was finally over and the peace treaty was going on, one of our colonels was actually on the peace treaty committee. So we had him tell what was going on at a peace treaty, what was involved in it.
Because
That
there
was one of our
again-
last shows we did, yeah.
Yeah, and TV was still pretty
In
new
its
on the
infancy, yes,
horizon,
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
it? Yeah,
yeah.
it was still mostly radio, wasn't
And we
it?
did, it was all ad-lib, it was amazing,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
If somebody today would say, you're going to do a television show right now, I said, what? Where's the script? But we
Yeah.
was freelancing and we didn't care, It was fun,
Yeah.
Because we were young and ignorant too at the time.
So the Korean War ended, and you chose to stay in the military after the end of the Korean War?
Well, I stayed in until December 1954,
Okay.
and that's when I got out.
Mhm.
And I was married by then. We got married in October to
Mhm.
my wife, Angela.
Mhm.
And I took a job in radio in Twin Falls for a few months after I got out of the service.
Mhm.
And then I decided I'd be better off going to college because I had some GI Bill coming for my 4 years in the military.
Mhm.
And so my wife and I packed up and went back to Cleveland. And I got a job working at Swift and Company as a quality control inspector for the meat processing thing.
Right.
And then I went to college and enrolled for the next semester and went for the next 3 years at Western Reserve, and I was majoring in drama, theater arts, and television.
Mhm.
At the same time, I started doing some freelance television in Cleveland for pay, you know, on the local stations. Before it was recorded, everything was live in those days.
Right.
You didn't have a chance to, you know, look at the videotape. You
Cut
just did it.
and go back and do it again.
We did that for about a year and a half, and I worked in radio in Cleveland for about 6 months for a station WJMO. I was the sports director, and I was also doing a lot of promo work for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got an offer to come back to Twin Falls, Idaho. A friend of mine I was with in the service had left before I did, and he was working at a station now called KTFI in Twin Falls. I think it's still there. And he said, they had an opening, would I be interested? He said, I know you're out of college. I said, yeah, my wife would love to go back home because it was only 30 miles from her home, and her mother and father was still there, and a lot of her friends. So we packed up and went back to Twin Falls and did the first 2 years at KTFI, and then I had a chance to get into television, and I took a job at Clicks Television, KLIX TV, and I did that until, I guess it was December. And then I got called to active duty, and I had to go to be in Washington, D.C. on the 2nd or 3rd of January, 1962.
And why were you called back to active duty? What was happening?
Well, I was a second lieutenant then. I had gotten a commission in the Army Reserve about a year before, because I had tried to get one in the Air Force. I went back to the Air Force Reserve before when I got the job in Twin Falls with a friend of mine who didn't want to stay in the Air Force. He got out early. But now he joined the reserve to get a little bit more money while he was working in radio with me. So we did that for a couple of years. And I tried to get a commission because I had my degree by then. And they said I didn't have any of the skills they wanted because they didn't want an announcer. They didn't need him, you know.
And the Vietnam War was escalating at this point?
It just about started, yes. Yeah.
What were your feelings about the Vietnam War?
Well, at first it was just a skirmish, you know. It was nothing going in full blast. We were just trying to holding positions and keeping the Viet Cong to rush into South Vietnam. It didn't really escalate until 1962-63 when I was in Germany working for American Forces Network. I was a station manager in Stuttgart for a couple of years.
That's where you went after you
after
re-enlisted?
After I left Washington, D.C. Yeah.
Okay.
After the Kennedy funeral, yes.
So you re-enlisted, or they brought you back into active duty in 1960?
In
was it?
Well, I got my orders in November 1961. I actually didn't have to report until the 3rd of January, 62.
Okay, and
So
you were in Washington, D.C.
We were in no, I took my wife back home to Cleveland first, and then I drove on to D.C. the next day.
Okay.
And I started on the 3rd of December, 3rd of January in 1962, and I was actually on active duty.
And what did they assign you to?
I was the radio TV officer in the headquarters military district of Washington.
Okay. Which meant that you worked on public relations.
Public
once
relations,
again.
public affairs programs,
Okay.
news, radio, television, anything of that nature.
Would you tell us where you were the day that President Kennedy was shot and killed?
I was sitting at my desk in the headquarters military district of Washington. I had been working on what they call a protocol book, which everything that happened in the District of Washington we were responsible for if it was Army. If it was a joint service, Army always had control because we were the oldest service. And I was bringing the book up to date. It was about 2 years out of date, so I was calling all the other branches of the service, getting who their commanders were, where their phone numbers were, are the people still there, blah, 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 on and ad infinitum. And the last thing I came upon was the funeral for heads of state. That was one of the last pages in the book. The last time we'd actually used that was for the John Foster Dulles funeral in 1954-55. So it was way out of date. This was, 6, 7 years before. So then I was going every day in the last couple of months. I'd call one of the places and say, who's in charge now? Give me your phone numbers, your addresses, Army, Navy, Marines Corps, all of this. And this was on the 21st of December, I guess. November. And I was sitting at my desk, and I was just turned the page to that. And it was time to go to lunch. So I put a piece of paper in there and went down and got a cup of coffee. Came back, just about to open the book to finish my work. The teletype in the corner started. Tick, 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 tick. I had a teletype for 2 different sources. And I usually ignored it because there were very minor things happening, on the weekend. And I just ignored it. And the secretary, one of the sergeants, female sergeant, walked in and she looked at it and she said, "Oh, Captain," or Lieutenant, I was a lieutenant then, she said, they've shot the president. Marge, this is no place to kid. She said, I'm not kidding, sir. And she was crying. And before I could get to the teletype, the room filled. My boss came in first. He said, give me the book. I got to see the colonel right away, the general. So I opened the book, and I had stopped at funerals for heads of state. That was one of the last things I had to work on. And I hadn't done anything on it, so I flowed the book, gave it to him. And he says, I'll be back in a few minutes. He went down the hall.
How did you feel? I mean,
when
you were a
was in
child,
shock.
you'd experienced
Yeah.
Roosevelt's death, and
And now here I'm
his
working at
assassination. How
President Kennedy.
how did you
He's
feel?
shot. I just, we were all stunned. Now, we weren't sure he was dead. He was shot. That's all we knew.
Right.
So we waited around for about 40 minutes, and everybody of note was in the general's office with my boss and all the other heads of the various departments. And they called over to the Army and Navy and Marine people to come in and get, because we would be in charge of what went on, but they would be part of it because this was the head of state. So it was an all-service function. Everybody would be taking part in it. So we waited until about 1:30 in the afternoon, our time, Washington time, listening to the radio, getting reports. He's on his way here. There's people outside waiting. We don't know what's happening yet. And finally, about 1:30 our time in Washington, they said, it's been noted that President Kennedy has died at an approximate time. He will be flying back to Washington, D.C. Lyndon Johnson will be sworn in as president, blah, 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 and that was it. And I sat there and said, oh, my God, he's really dead. And I looked at my boss, and he said, well, I want you to go home now, get a fresh uniform, be back here at 6 o'clock tonight. We're going to do an all-nighter, because then we had part of our press office was civilian workers as well, and they handle all the outside written press. We were getting calls from all over the world wanting a spot in the rotunda for the funeral. They wanted photographers there, they wanted television people there, radio. It was just a madhouse. So I remember going home, and that was the first night driving home to Arlington, where I was living in Arlington at the time, about 10 or 15-minute drive. Usually it was just a madhouse. People were going crazy and trying to get home. Everybody was just unbelievably driving slowly. Nobody smiling, just
Total shock.
total shock.
Mm.
Nobody racing, everybody just took their time getting home.
Yeah.
And I remembered my wife said, he's dead, huh? I said, yeah. And our kids were only 2 and 3 years old then, so they didn't really know. And all they were playing on the television and radio was the dirge music with a picture of President Kennedy, just his profile and the music, somber music. And you listen to it and you started getting weepy, thinking about all the things you had done with him and how many times I had been in his presence, as a radio TV officer.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, I couldn't eat. I think I had a cup of coffee, maybe a donut, and I said, that's all I want. And she said, we'll go up and shave. And I said, I got to go back to work, and I'll be there probably all day tomorrow. I probably won't get home till tomorrow night.
You'd had a bit of personal contact with President Kennedy too, hadn't
Yes,
you?
I had, yes.
In your position
In my
in
position.
the Air Force within DC, in Washington
Yes,
D.C.
well,
yeah.
the first thing I did was only on duty about a month and a half,
Mm-hmm.
and I was supposed to go out to the airport in Maryland and set up a meeting with him and John Glenn, who had just made the first man-in-flight show. He was going to meet him at the airport and have a ceremony for him. And I said, wow, my first chance to really see the president up close. So I drove out there. We had a staff car. I took one of my assistants with me. And it was snowing and it was wet, so we decided to move it from outside into a hangar. So that put us even closer to the president and John Glenn. And I remember standing up to the side of the cordon where all the photographers and TV people were getting their shots, and I'm thinking to myself, this is March. I said, 2.5 months ago, I'm in Twin Falls, Idaho. And I was doing the news the night he was elected. I was on camera putting up who won, who was ahead, and all the results of all the, national as well as local. And the next morning, of course, when I left that night, Nixon was ahead in the Republican state of Idaho. So I didn't know until the next morning that Kennedy had actually won.
Mm. Did you like him?
Oh, yes, very much, yeah. And so I was supposed to go out, and I stood there in awe saying, there's President Kennedy and John Glenn at this historic moment. I said, wow.
And so back to after the assassination and you were home, then you went back to the Capitol drove
yeah.
back to the
I
Capitol.
had to go back to the Capitol.
And
yeah.
did you know what you were going to be doing?
Well,
assignments
yes,
that
I
had been
did.
made?
Yeah, they told me that I was going to be in charge of setting up the rotunda, and that's the way I had the book. I had the diagram of the rotunda, and the way it ended up is a picture you've got there of it, I think. Yeah, and I had to work with all of the press people at the Capitol, both on the Senate and the Congress side, and we had to set up the stands, and we had to make sure that everything was in place. There had to be places for radio. There were going to be 32 cameras there on all those stands. Film, they were still doing film and television at the time. And we had to find a place for the radio people, the networks, and the local stations. So that place was really jam-packed with equipment and requirements.
And you had only how much time to prepare
We had
this?
from Saturday until Sunday noon when he would be coming into state. So I was there all day Saturday from about 7 in the morning until 11 at night, and I went home and came back the next day about 8 o'clock in the morning, and that's when the funeral procession would start. They would take him from the White House to the Catholic Church. The ceremony would be held there. Then they would bring him into state about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's where all the casket bearers would bring him up the stairs into the rotunda and onto the Lincoln catafalque, which is what Mrs. Kennedy had asked for.
Did you see Mrs. Kennedy or any of the Kennedy families before the actual funeral service itself?
Well, I just saw them when they came into the rotunda.
Into
Yeah,
the
we all had to
rotunda.
be there when everybody was in place. All of the visitors and the guests of honor, the congressmen, the senators, their wives and families, and all the guests who were going to speak. There were senators and congressmen, and reverends were going to make little speeches, and then they would bring the casket in and put it on the Lincoln catafalque. And then Mrs. Kennedy, and I think John wasn't there, I think it was Carolyn, helped her carry the flowers to the casket. And she went back, and then I walked up to now President Lyndon Johnson and to his associate. I said, does the president know when he's supposed to bring his flowers? He said, yes. So I backed off, and then Mrs. Kennedy came back, and then Lyndon Johnson took his flower and put her down and brought it back.
But was it almost surreal?
It was surreal. No one, everybody was so quiet. It was just like a very mournful funeral,
And this is an original magazine that you
Yes,
kept.
it was,
It's called
yes.
Memories, and I'm just going to put it on film. Tell us why in this picture there are several people: Captain Grove, Lieutenant Byrd, Lieutenant. There you are, right
yes.
here.
No, I was farther away. I was
You.
standing where the Kennedy family and the Johnson family were.
Okay.
Captain Grove was actually the officer in charge of the ceremonial unit. He had responsibility for the casket team, for the rifle team, the buglers, and the men at the guarding of the unknown soldier. And the other one, the young lieutenant, he was the one in charge of the casket team. He had to train all of the different soldiers. They were Army, Navy, Marines, Air Corps, Coast Guard. They all offered 2 people each, and he had to pick out the 8 strongest to make sure that they could all handle a 1,000-pound coffin. That's what it was. It was a steel coffin, 1,000 pounds. And they had to carry that up and down the step. They were practicing with it, with a similar coffin for a whole Friday night and all day Saturday, carrying it up and down the Capitol steps to see which team could do it the best without stumbling.
This is the pamphlet that was given out. Was this given to the people who came to the
Yes,
funeral?
that was the memorandum before the
February
funeral.
13th, 1964, this says. And of course it has hats from every division of the military. Did you accompany the casket or John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, to the graveside?
No, I did not. I went later. They took him with the ceremony. They had the horse-drawn carriage, and they went over the Arlington Bridge. I went a different way to get to the cemetery so I'd be in place. And of course the carriage, it took them a long time to get there. And I was already at the cemetery by the time they came up for the funeral and placed the coffin at the graveside.
And then you were assigned a position there for, 5 days?
The next week or so
The
I
next
had to
week
be
or
there, because
so,
every day there was
people came.
some people coming. There were people
Lots
wanting to
of
get
people.
stories, people from
Yeah.
all over the world, newspapers from England, France, Russia, China. They were getting their stories. And of course on Thanksgiving was the big day because they knew that the whole Kennedy family would come in force, on Thanksgiving Day, which they did early in the morning, except for Jackie, she came later. And after the Kennedy family came, all of them, Carolyn, John, all the other ones, not John, John Jr., the little boy.
John, yeah.
They left, and then Princess Grace of Monaco came by herself in a black outfit with a veil, and she spent about 20 minutes kneeling on this wet ground. We put a tarpaulin down, but it was still wet. And she left, and we all saluted her because she was royalty, former American princess, they called her. And then a few moments later, Mrs. Kennedy herself came by herself. And she knelt for, a good 20 minutes, touching the flowers. Of course, the night before they had put in Patrick Kennedy, the little boy that was stillborn years before. They moved him into the gravesite next to his father. And so she was tending his grave too, and she just, was just looking around. And she got up and looked at all the flowers. At the top of the Custis Lee Mansion is where this was, just below the Custis Lee Mansion. All the way up the hill, which was probably 40 or 50 yards long, were rows upon rows of flowers, which they had been sent from all over the world and all over the country. And she just sort of murmured to herself, look at all those beautiful flowers. And it started to rain, and she ignored it and started walking up. She went down, back and forth, on every aisle, all the way to the top, looking at picking up cards, looking. And some of the guys started to follow her, and she got up to the top and walked across. And this was Captain Groves, who was in charge of the whole funeral situation. He sees her, and she starts to slip. And he waves to me. He says, "Bickley, get up here." So I ran up, and he grabbed her by one arm, and I took her by her left elbow, and we walked her down to her limousine. And the Secret Service guys were walking ahead of us saying, "Please make way for Mrs. Kennedy, make way for Mrs. Kennedy," all the way down to the car. We opened the door, let her in, and she nodded, and we saluted. She smiled again, and they drove off.
A gracious lady, wasn't she?
She was, and Captain Grove looked at me. He said, "Man," he said, "if she had fallen, we'd have looked like a bunch of idiots. All these soldiers around and nobody trying to help her, and all the Secret Service guys were just ignoring, trying to keep the crowd away from her, not knowing what situation she was in, with the slippery slope."
Yeah, well, it was a pretty unknown situation all the way around anyway.
Oh,
It
yes,
happened so
it was,
fast.
yeah.
President Kennedy's grave is a very simple grave, too.
It is,
I
yes,
saw it once, and I was amazed.
Yeah.
It's very emotional, but very simple. Yeah.
A funny thing happened the night before when they put the eternal flame in.
Yes.
We got over there early in the morning waiting for the casket, hadn't got there yet, and the flame went out. And everybody's panicking. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, one of the majors, who was a photography officer, he pulled out his cigarette lighter and lit it. He said, "That's what we're going to do." Go right up again. Yeah, all these people not knowing how to, to get a lighter and relight the flame.
And President Kennedy would have liked that humor.
Yes,
he liked humor.
He did,
He
yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Now, just a very short time later, you were also involved in General MacArthur's.
Yeah, in the following
service,
April.
the
That was
following
after I
April.
decided to extend my duty.
I see.
See, I would have been actually only on 2 years. On the 31st of December, I was actually going to be out of the service. But after the funeral, the day I left the cemetery, I was feeling so bad, and I said, this man died for his country. And you want to go worry about getting a job in the civil service or radio? He gave his life, and so many other people have also. And I went home, I said, "Would you mind if I decided to stay in service?" He said, "Whatever you want to do, I like the service." So the next morning I talked to Colonel Fant, who was my boss. I said, "Sir, is it too late to get my extension for the military to go on?" He said, "No, sirree." He said, "I'll take it over today and see what they say." And he got my signature, and he said, "You're in." He said, "Now where do you want to go?" I said, What do you want to do in your next assignment?" He said, "You want to work in radio, television?" I said, "Oh, I'd love to." So he got me assignment to the Defense Information School to learn how to be a broadcast officer for overseas. And that was about 6 weeks long, and then my wife and I and the whole family went over to Germany, Stuttgart. But before that, we had a chance to go to the World's Fair. And there was an exhibit that the Army had put up for the World's Fair in that particular year, and I did the vocal narration for the Army exhibit. And we went to see it, and I had forgotten I had done that. And as we walked through, we went into the room where the tape was playing, and all of a sudden I hear this voice, my wife said, that sounds like you. I said, yeah. I said, it is me. I did that. I said, that was 2 years ago we were doing it. I said, well, wow, I had a chance to hear something I did finally for years and years and years, yeah.
And so you moved to Germany, and,
We went to Germany,
and at this point
yeah.
the Vietnam War was escalating.
It was starting to
President
pick
Johnson
up,
was in
yes,
office,
yes.
and things were getting kind of crazy
Yes,
at that point.
and we lost about 3 people the first month I was there. They were curtailed. A couple of young lieutenants and a captain were
The first-
curtailed and sent to Vietnam.
Oh, when you were in Germany?
When I was in Germany,
Mhm, they were sent
but
to
I was in
Vietnam.
Stuttgart, and I was a deputy commander there. And then about 6 months later, I became the commander of that radio station. And we spent 1 year in Stuttgart, and from there I was then brought back to Frankfurt, which was the headquarters of a 7-station network. And
And the network was responsible for giving military news?
well, yeah,
or-
well, just everything. Every kind of news. We said anything that was played in America, we
How-
taped and sent over. So it was just like home, you know.
Yeah, I see.
Uh-huh.
Okay, for
It
the
was as much
servicemen.
of Americana as we could get.
Yeah.
Plus, we had local news and regional news,
Right.
and of course broadcast news of any type, you know.
A lot of people believe that that the civilian news media, it was the first war the news media truly had control of. I mean, and how did the military, your position,
Mhm.
your experience differ than perhaps from, were you giving the same kind of news? Were you?
Well, we wrote our own news at
Uh-huh.
AFN, and we had our own staff of writers. We would have the teletype system. So we were getting the same news that the newspapers and the radio and TV stations in the country were getting, of course. So we just used the same news, and we had our announcers. Some were civilian, some were military announcers, and we did broadcast, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in radio. And so we had a staff of maybe 150 people working, all over the country. Plus we had our little substations all over Germany as well. And one of our jobs was to visit them frequently and see how they were doing, were they having problems. So one of my jobs was to go around different stations and see what they were doing.
Was it also a responsibility for you all to keep the morale up of the military of the guys?
Well,
that were
yes, in
fighting
a way, but
Uh-huh.
anybody in broadcasting loves the job they're doing, so they all were anxious to get on the air, so they really had a high morale always to start with,
Yeah.
And then I was transferred from Stuttgart to Frankfurt, and I became the deputy commander of the network as a captain, and a month later the colonel was sent back to Washington, D.C. for a higher job, and I became a commander of the whole network as a captain
Wow.
for about 2.5 months. And then I was curtailed and sent to the Defense Information School, where I was to train 100 soldiers to be going to Vietnam as individual 5-man public affairs teams. We were going to be attached to various units in Vietnam. And it was my job then as the captain, I was a senior officer, to do the training for all these units. We had 20 officers and 80 men. So we had we had 25-man groups. And we trained for about a month and a half. And we were supposed to leave in February, but we actually didn't get going until the 4th of March. And we were aboard a ship. We went on an airplane to Oakland and then boarded a troop transport on the 4th of April, on the 4th of March, and we didn't land in country until the 28th of March. But our tour of duty began the day we set foot on the troop ship. So by the time we got to Vietnam, we'd already had a month in country as far as our government was concerned, or the Army was concerned.
And so how long were you actually in Vietnam?
I was only there about 23 days.
Mhm.
I spent a week learning what I was supposed to do, in country, and then I was transferred to.
Where were you in Vietnam?
At first I went to Phu Loy,
Phu Loy.
and then I went to Xi'an,
Okay.
about 35 miles away from the capital.
Mhm.
And my first job was with the Division Artillery Unit. My men and myself were a 5-man team. We had 3 enlisted men, myself as a captain, and I had a lieutenant, Billy Blackston, who was my deputy. And we had radio and television work to do. We would record, it was just about the time for Easter, so they were recording hometown interviews with all of our soldiers and sending the radio tape back, or if it was video, send the video to their hometown. And that was about the first week and a half we were there. And then I had a chance to escort Henry Fonda. He came on what they called a handshaking tour. He came to our unit first, and I had to escort him around the area. And the next day I turned him over to another division that was going to go and take him up in a helicopter. And then he would come back to us that night, and then I was hoping to set up an interview with him for posterity. And when he left, I said, when you come back tonight, if you're not too tired, I'd like to do at least a 10 or 15-minute interview for radio. He said, I'd love to. So he went off on his merry way with the other units, and he got one of these thrilling helicopter rides. He said they took him up to about 1,500, 6,000 feet and drew him straight on down to the ground. He said he almost lost his breakfast, but then they pulled out in time. That was the thrilling part of the trip, he said. And he wondered why he was sent over there, because he said he didn't sing or dance or tell funny stories. They said, I guess the people at the USO said, Mr. Fonda, they love you because you're their hero. All the great movies you've made all your life, they want to see you in person. So he came over and he just went through all the units and talked to them and chatted with them and ate with them and was a regular guy.
Were you there when Jane Fonda came over?
No, I wasn't, no. And one thing he asked me, he said, please don't ask me any questions about my daughter.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He said, when you interview me, let's not mention.
Don't
He
wanna
said,
talk
"Also,
about her."
anything you want to talk about, but I don't want to talk about my daughter, if you don't mind. He said, not at all. So I talked to him for about 20 minutes on tape. It was fun.
And then you were injured.
Well, the next day, it's funny, after he left, I took him to the helicopter to get him out of there, and somebody came and said, Captain, they want to see you in the colonel's office. And I walked back, he said, you're being transferred to the Big Red One. General Hay wants you to be the commander of a unit there, public affairs, and you're going to be part of what they were calling was a pacification team. What had happened when I first got to Vietnam in middle March, they had a 20-man team with a colonel, 3 or 4 officers, a lot of sergeants, enlisted men who had a lot of skills. They were all either clowns, they were technicians, they were brilliant. They could talk all kinds of Vietnamese languages, and they would go from one village to the other. They would bring medicine to the people. They'd help the kids. They'd bring food, and they'd try to convince them to let us know, let the Army know, if there are any Viet Cong in the area planning any bad things. And that's part of their job, pacifying these little villagers, giving them food, helping them, and getting their word that they would let us know, sometimes leaving cell phones with them, so they could call us if there was something going on. Well, this was a 20-man team, and it was pretty successful for about 4 or 5 months, I understand, in retrospect. Well, one night, they got ambushed by the Viet Cong and almost obliterated. They lost more than half their soldiers, and the rest were wounded. Well, General Hay, who was in charge of the Big Red One, he was so mad, he said, no longer am I going to use only 20 soldiers to do this pacification. I'm going to put in a battalion. And that's exactly what he did. He went out and got an American battalion and a Vietnamese battalion to work together. And so my job was then to set up the pacification team and to help with the broadcasting and to the public affairs is part of it, with our unit.
So what happened? How were you injured?
Well, the first night I was with them. The first day of the event, we had, as I say, a battalion of Vietnamese soldiers and a battalion of Army soldiers, and we were driving up and down different roads in that Vietnam area to find out which would be a good location to pacify. We did it all day long. We went different directions, and finally, close to sundown, we got word we were going to bivouac for the night in a deserted Vietnamese school. So it was in the jungle. So we all got out of the Jeep and walked into the bivouac area, and we were going to be set with the Vietnamese colonel and his staff. We were going to be doing it together with them. And their soldiers were supposed to start to the left and go around through the jungle at arm's length. They were supposed to be able to touch the next soldier's hand all the way through the jungle until they met up with our American troops on the other side, hopefully at 10 o'clock. They wanted to get it done by 10 p.m. that night, starting at 6 or 6:30. Well, we were having dinner with the Vietnamese colonel, and he was very, very hospitable. He spoke good English, because nobody else did. I couldn't speak Vietnamese, and only a couple of the people with me understood Vietnamese. And he had fixed a really nice meal, and we were eating. And all of a sudden, the phone rang, and his troops wanted to know if they could stop, because they were getting too tired and too late. He said, no, you keep going. You cannot stop. You must meet up with the Americans, They'd call every 10 minutes, can we stop now? You've got to meet up with the Americans. Well, by the by 10 o'clock, our troops were in place. The Vietnamese troops didn't join up until about 1 o'clock in the morning. So they left a big gap in the line. So anyhow, when they finally did close up, we got in the morning, about 7 o'clock, we went into the village, and I got in the Jeep with the major and the driver, and it was the guy that we were going to see what was on the outskirts, what was happening, and get some stories if we could. And just before we started to go through the village, we were stopped by an Army colonel. And he said, "Could I ride with you people, see what you're doing?" I said, "Yeah." Well, being the colonel, he gets the seat of honor, which is always to the right, rank right in a car. So I moved over and sat on the radio. And he got in. Now, I noticed he was just wearing his fatigue cap and his fatigue outfit. I had on my steel pot and my flak jacket, and so did everybody in the Jeep. So we drove up and down the perimeter. We went about 200 yards, and then another 200 yards across, which they had dug out for the village. And we were just coming down the last 150 yards to get back to the village when there was a little road shutting off into the jungle. Well, the major said, "Why don't we see what's there?" And I noticed the colonel had kind of squirted. "I don't think it's a very good idea." "Well, let's see, let's go down a little bit." So he turned the Jeep and went in about maybe 30 feet. And it was just like a wall had dropped because we couldn't hear a thing. And there was all this noise going on 20 feet behind us in the open. But once we got into the jungle, it was just like a wall shut. And the colonel said, "This is a great place for an ambush. Let's get out of here." We turned the Jeep around, and just as we were leaving, I felt a warm rush of air, and I felt myself being lifted. And the next thing I know, I'm on the ground, and the wheels of the Jeep are spinning. And I'm shaking my head, and I didn't know what was happening. And all of a sudden, I saw an arm in front of me, and it had red hair. And I said, "I don't have red hair, not my arm." And then I heard the voice of the driver say, "Captain, are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." I said, "Can you see the major?" He said, "No, he's on the other side of the Jeep." I said, "Can you see the colonel?" He said, "No, I can't." He said, "But don't worry, I've already contacted with my phone. A chopper is coming for us real soon." I said, "Good," and I passed out again. Next thing I know, being helped up, walked to the helicopter, climbed in. The driver was with me, and I said to somebody, "Where's the colonel?" He said, "I don't know." And then I passed out. The next thing I woke up, I'm in the operating room, and I just opened my eyes, and I said to the doctor, "How's the colonel?" And he either said, "I don't know," or he didn't make it. I didn't know. And I didn't find out till several weeks later what had happened to him. And he had been killed outright. The major had 2 broken arms because he fell out of the Jeep. He wasn't wounded, but he had 2 broken arms. I think he did get some shrapnel in his shoulder. And the driver was all right, but he had been slightly wounded. And
it took 5 months then.
I was in the
medical
hospital
care
in
for-
Vietnam, I think about a week and a half.
Mhm.
And I remember I did have 2 seizures. I remember that. Funny, even though I couldn't talk or think. I remember nurses sticking something in my mouth to keep me from, swallowing my tongue. And I remember being moved to the Philippines for one night, and after that to Tokyo to a hospital there. And I spent at least 3 weeks or almost a month there rehabbing, learning how to walk and talk and think all over again.
Gene, this is the Purple Heart that you received because of the experience that you just described to us in Vietnam.
Yes.
And we wanted to be sure to have this on record in your film. This was received by you, Captain Eugene Bickley, United States Army, for wounds received in action during the month of April 1967 in the Republic.
Okay.
Gene, could you tell us what we're looking at, a picture of the soldier with the rifle over his shoulder?
Yes, that is one of the soldiers who is a guard at the guard of the Plaza of the Unknowns. At one time it was just the unknown soldier, but now there are several soldiers from different wars, so now they call it the Plaza of the Unknowns.
At Arlington
At
Cemetery.
Arlington Cemetery, and that is another one of the jobs that Captain Groves has to do at the old guard.
Let me bring back so that we can see again the magazine that you brought in, because you do have a story to tell about these
Yes.
these 2 men that served with you during the funeral.
Right.
All right.
As you can see, Captain Grove, can you point to him, Sue?
Yes.
Captain Grove
is here.
he was the officer in charge of the entire funeral, as far as the 100 men who were involved in it. He was the one that on Thanksgiving Day, he and I helped Mrs. Kennedy walk down the slippery slope back to her car. The following Saturday night, I was on staff duty, and a telephone call came in at midnight, and I had to take it as a staff duty officer. And the officer said, I have to report a death of an active duty officer. I said, go ahead. He said, tonight in his quarters, Captain Michael D. Groves died of either a heart attack or a cerebral hemorrhage. We're not sure which yet. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I just talked to him the other day. He said, I just talked to him 2 minutes before it happened. He collapsed at the dinner table. I couldn't believe it.
And Lieutenant Byrd also.
Lieutenant Byrd then, he became the commander of the unit. We buried Mike on Monday, just below President Kennedy's grave. Mrs. Kennedy sent flowers and a note of condolences to his wife, who was 8 months pregnant with their second child. He was 28 years old. But she didn't know that he was on the other side of her, helping her down the hill. When I told you about the rain, when I was helping her on the left side, down to the car, she had no idea that he was the one that helped her down there.
And what happened to Lieutenant Byrd?
Lieutenant Byrd was actually wounded before I was in Vietnam. He was wounded in January of that year, and he was severely wounded in the head, and he had to retire from the military. I checked up on him later and got the story, from his father. And it was just a couple of months after that that I was wounded in the head, but I survived and I was able to continue on active duty. So there were the three people who were involved with the Kennedy funeral. As you can see in the picture, Mike was closest to the casket. The other lieutenant was just behind the casket, and I was way up in the doorway by the Kennedy family.
Yes.
And he was killed, he was severely wounded, and I was wounded, but I survived because I was, I guess, farther away from the casket. It almost seemed like the curse of the Kennedys goes on.
Gene, the picture that I'm showing now is from it looks like an award from the Academy of Television Arts and Science. What was this for?
Oh, that was for a program which we had recorded Christmas before with the U.S. Army Band and Chorus, which was a show that was put on for the general public in one of the big theaters in downtown Washington, D.C., and I had a friend of mine who was a director at WRC Television in Washington. I told him to come to a rehearsal, and he was very impressed with the performance, so he decided that they could do it for a television show, a local television show in Washington, D.C. at NBC WRC, and he directed it. And he put me on the thing as the executive producer of the show. So when it won an Emmy Award the following April, he let us have a picture of the Emmy, although it would always go back to WRC TV for their showcase. But we had myself and the Colonel holding the Emmy Award very briefly before we took it over and got a similar photo with Sam Laboda and the director of the Army Band, and they had a chance to hold it before it went back to WRC.
How exciting. How exciting. You came home from Vietnam and were not here very long when you lost another friend
Yes.
from the war. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I was home working as an instructor at the Defense Information School in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I had just been working there just a few months after I returned from duty. And I got a letter from Billy Blackston, who was my second in command. He took over the unit after I left Vietnam. And he spent almost his whole tour there. It was just a few days before he was supposed to rotate that I had gotten a letter from him, which he'd sent a few days before. And I got it on the early part of February, and he said he was coming home, and he and his wife were going to fly from Texas after they got home and spend a week with my wife and I because we were together before we went to Vietnam together. And I was very happy to get that letter. And that night, I went to an incoming party for incoming officers, Army, Navy, Marines, for the Defense Information School training. And as I was walking down the hall in my dress blues to go to the dinner table, one of the officers that I knew who was in public affairs stopped me. He said, "It was too bad about Billy, wasn't it?" I said, "Oh, no." I said, "I've got a letter from him. He's coming home. He'll be home in a couple of days." He stopped. He said, "I'm sorry, Gene. He was killed yesterday." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, as far as we can determine, there was an incoming bomb coming in from the Viet Cong, and he let his men get in the foxhole first, and he jumped in last, and he got a direct hit, and it killed him instantly, and he saved the life of his 3 enlisted men by shielding their bodies."
My Gosh,
And
what
I
a
just
terrible
I just
shock.
couldn't. I said, before I'm going to a party, I know this.
Yeah.
I didn't have a
Yeah.
very good time. You know, you can always put on a face, but I
Right.
didn't stay long that night.
Right.
I think I had dinner and went home and cried.
Yeah. That's a terrible
And we
loss.
called his wife,
Mm.
Betty, and we said, "Look, Betty," I said, "we want you to come and spend at least a week or 10, or as long as you want, with us after the funeral." And she did. She buried her husband a few days later, and then she came up and spent a week with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we were very happy to have her. I think it was kind of nice for her to be with us, being around children. She didn't have to worry too much about, what she had to look forward to for a while anyhow.
Very hard losing
It was
a
very
friend.
difficult.
You lost several friends in Vietnam.
Yes.
In the 1970s, while you were still in the Army, you were awarded 3 times a Top Freedom Award,
Oh.
which had to do with things that you wrote, pieces that you wrote, poems that you wrote?
Well, what it was is every year, the Freedom Foundation at Valley Forge would have a writing contest, and they would have a theme that you were supposed to write on. And the first one that I entered was, I think, what is the price of freedom? And I think I thought about it for a couple of 3 days, and then I said, well, I can't think of anything but a poem, so I kind of sat down and jotted down a few ideas and turned it into a page-and-a-half poem.
And you won the award?
I won, and not the grand prize, but I won one of the top prizes.
This is the poem that you wrote that, with which you won for the first
For
time.
the Freedom Foundation at Valley Forge, yes.
Yes.
You know, I had a
Could you
chance to
read
actually
this?
go there that time, too, when I won the award and had a chance to walk through, and had a wonderful show that they put on at the Valley Forge. You feel like you're back in 1776.
Could you read the poem?
Yes, I'd
for
love
us?
to. It's
Thank you.
called The Freedom Game. What is the price of freedom? An ounce of blood in a rice paddy in Vietnam? A drop of sweat from a trainee at Fort Ord? A splintered bone from a copter crash in Korea? A cold chill from a missile scare at Guantanamo Bay? A swollen ankle from a forced march in Bataan? A lungful of seawater in a ship's bowels in Pearl Harbor? A lacerated knee from barbed wire near Chateau Thierry? A mouthful of dust from running up a hill called San Juan? A nostril full of stench from the carnage at Bull Run? A handful of sand to cover a corpse at the Alamo? A scorched eyebrow from powder burns at New Orleans? A frozen toe at Valley Forge? Listen, there is no cut rate price tag on freedom. No discount house in which to shop, no flea market where you can bargain, and no credit card on which to charge. It is not an inalienable right, nor a God-given prize. And yet, it is more precious than the most glittering gold or rarest jewel, more elusive than a beam of sunlight or a baby's fragile smile. Oh, and once lost, it is seldom regained. Freedom is not a game of finder-keeper, rather always loser-weeper. How then does one hold fast this elusive as sunlight thing? With the frozen toe at Valley Forge, with the scorched eyebrow at New Orleans, with a handful of sand at the Alamo, with fervor in all hostilities, with vigilance in grateful peace. That is the tender we must pay to hold our priceless freedom way.
What an honor to have had you read that.
Well, thank you. It's
For
an honor to do it
this
for you.
film. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
And so you won 2 other times.
Yes,
With,
following years, yeah. They were rather lengthy ones.
Uh-huh.
One was the values of living, with things I thought people have to do to maintain their American way. And the last one was a poem, and I can't remember what I wrote to my son on his 12th birthday.
This is the last poem that you wrote, the 3rd award that you received.
Yes.
Would you read this one
Well,
for us?
Be glad to. Thank you, Sue. Dearest Greg, Today, my son, you're 12 years old. A dozen Aprils count. You've used them well, I must admit. Your strengths you do not flaunt. So let it be for dozens more, as days do fade away, and keep your health and happiness, despite the world's dismay. Dismay it all your courage, son, something that it can't take. To know that someone fine as you aren't bothered by the fake. Just live your life and have your fun, and let the arrows fly. And when they fall a few feet short, just smile and say, nice try. You'll say it, son. I know you will, because you made that way. You've never shrunk from any risk, my son. You will not start today. The risks that I am speaking of are life's and hard to see. But if you live 1,000 years, you'll still tackle them with glee. So face today now bright and clear, with passion and with grace. The critics cannot get you down if a smile is on your face. Love, Dad.
What a
Happy
gift.
birthday.
What a gift to give your son forever. And all your future heirs, really. What a gift. This is an actual newspaper. This is the newspaper article that that actually has the second award home. But this is what you look like. Very handsome young man.
Not too much different, huh?
No, you did not. You have not changed much at all.
Hair's a little lighter. Face a little fatter.
And so in 1978, your military career began to come to an end. And there are several meritorious service awards that you were given, and I'd like to put those in the film so that we have those on record.
Well, thank you,
also.
Sue. Thank you.
These are to be very proud of, I'm sure, by you and by your family, as it should be. And this last one is your certificate of retirement.
Right,
When you
yeah.
actually left the military completely. So you started off in the Navy Reserves in high school.
Right.
And then you went active.
Active Air Force,
in the Air
enlisted.
Force. Enlisted and became active in the Air Force. And then you retired from the Air Force.
Went to college.
And went to college. That would be following Korea.
Following Korea, right.
And then you
Went back to radio in Twin Falls, 1958.
Right.
And in 1961, I was called to active duty on the Army Reserve. I was in the Air Force Reserve again, and I couldn't get a commission in the Air Force Reserve because I didn't have any of the skills they wanted. They said, "You're not a scientist. You're not a pilot. We don't need you.
So
Stay a reporter."
So you went into the Army.
I applied at the Army, and they accepted me. I got my commission on second lieutenant. I was 33 years old. In June of 1961, and I was called to duty in November of 1961 and reported to Washington, D.C. On January 3rd, 1962.
And then you retired from the Army in 1978.
In 1978, right.
And what did you do with your life after that? I mean, where did you and your wife live? Did you have a career in radio?
Oh, yeah, in
television following that?
Yeah, we stayed in Denver, where I retired.
And you had how many children by then?
We had two. Our daughter, they were both in high school by now, and out. Some are going to college. And our daughter was still in high school. And he eventually went to the University of Colorado, got his degree, and then he went to Georgia Emory University and studied anesthesiology, and became a physician's assistant, which he is to this day.
Your son is.
Working in Athens, Georgia. And of course, my wife is a nurse, so he married a nurse, so he's following his father's footsteps. And our daughter eventually graduated from the University of Georgia in theater arts, and then she got her master's degree at the University of Idaho 2.5 years ago, and now she is the head of the theater arts department at Yakima Junior College in Yakima, Washington.
Followed her father in theater. And what are your children's names?
My son is Gregory Scott Bickley, And our daughter is Terry Alicia Bickley.
Okay. How did you end up back in Idaho?
My wife's hometown. You know, we've been back and forth here many times in our career. It started here when I transferred from California in the Air Force in 1954. And it came back here again for television and radio in 1958, 59, 60. And I left for service in the Army from here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came out of the service. I went to Denver again for a while, and then we returned here in 1974. We've been here ever since.
Ever since. And so you finished a career then in radio and theater. Did you stay with that?
Well, let's see.
When
I finished my career, I went to work for a radio training company for 2 years. It was out of Texas, but they had an office here in Denver. So I worked for them for 2 years, and then an opening came, and I took a job with a college. I got my degree, master's degree in college, and then I sent to work for the civil service as a public affairs specialist for 12 years as a GS-11, and I was doing that until I retired in 1992, and then we moved back in 94 to Idaho.
Okay. You've had an incredible life.
Well, actually, I touched on 3 wars. Did you know that?
Well, you touched on 3 wars. You experienced how many presidents in your military career? I mean, you had not Roosevelt.
Well, I drove his touring car.
But you had
Kennedy. Yes.
And you were there through an enormous transition in our country with President Kennedy's death, and your direct involvement in that, and of course Lyndon Johnson becoming president of this country.
Right.
There is just no words really to thank you so much for what you have done for our country as an American veteran.
Thank you, but it's my honor to be able to put it down for posterity.
Well, this country really wouldn't be what it is today without men like you that were willing to put their own life on hold, their own personal life on hold, to become a part of our military and to participate and experience the wars that were necessary that happened, and you contributed so much. So
thank you, and I just grieve for the friends of mine that didn't make it. You know,
of course,
all the ones that, like Captain Grove and the lieutenant who was knocked out of the service. He's alive, thank God, but he's in a wheelchair. And all the other young men, Billy Blackston, who got killed in Vietnam with only 2 days left of active duty. It's horrifying when you feel that all these deaths occur, and we're still fighting a war that we should not be in, I think. But
let me ask you one last question before we end our interview. Could you give us a thought that you might have about how your military experiences, those years that you spent in the military, helped form you to become the man that you are today? Sort of a last thing to leave for your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And
well, I don't know that I'm such a unique person today. I mean, I've known a lot of friends of mine who have had military careers, and we all kind of feel pretty much the same way. You know, you have a job to do, and you do it. You don't feel heroic for doing it. As I say, I have never felt like a hero from that wound in Vietnam. I mean, I was riding in a Jeep. I was protected, and I still got wounded, but I didn't feel heroic. The man that gave his life, Colonel Tighe, to me, he was the hero. And his families, as I told you earlier, from the Civil War, I mean, from the Revolutionary War, right up to his own death, and probably even more of his relations after that, because they were all dedicated to serving his country and their country all the time. To me, they are the heroes. The young men today fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and all over the world, they're the heroes because they're being blown up by his people who want to take over the world, I guess. I don't know. The Al-Qaeda-minded people who, they say they're religious, but how can you kill people in the name of religion? You're supposed to save people in the name of religion, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, we appreciate you and what you've done for this country. We certainly appreciate your thoughts, and above all, we are so honored that you came here to the Warhawk Air Museum and allowed us to preserve your life history
Thank
as
you
best that we could.
for asking me, and I'm honored to be here, and I hope it helps somebody along the way.
It will. This is for future generations.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won, and the army goes rolling